Hello, learners. I welcome you to the fifth lecture of week 2. In this lecture, we will talk about deep ecology and shallow ecology. These two terms are coined by Arne Naess, who was a philosopher from Norway. And he coined these terms during 1970s. He raised a very strong argument. He said that we are making a large number of efforts to conserve environment, to protect environment, but expected outcomes are not coming. Rather, the situation is that condition of environmental degradation is getting worse day by day. He said that it speaks of the fact that there is something wrong with our very approach of understanding the problem and also our way of handling the problem. He said that till now, whatever we have done to protect the environment, that is based on anthropocentric approach. What he says, shallow ecology, where we are trying to solve the issue by some small changes in our consumption pattern, some incremental changes. And he says that at this point of time, what do we need? We need basically a radical shift in our very approach of handling the problem. And he says that in place of shallow ecology, we need deep ecology. So in this lecture, we will try to understand how Arne Naess differentiate between deep ecology and shallow ecology and various aspects of these two approaches. This is the outline of the lecture. These are the various aspects which we are going to cover in today's lecture. So to begin with the introduction, as I mentioned in the beginning only, that these two terms are coined by Arne Naess in his article, The Shallow and the Deep Long-Range Ecology Movements in 1973. Arne Naess was the one who critiqued the prevalent anthropocentric view, which places humans at the center. He argued that this mindset has actually led to a relation of master-slave between human world and nature. And Arne Naess was basically attempting to describe a deeper and a more spiritual approach to nature through his deep ecology approach. So firstly, we'll try to understand what is shallow ecology. Arne Naess defines it as a perspective that conceives and values natural diversity as a resource for humans. Why? Because it is an anthropocentric perspective. Naess says that according to shallow ecology, it is nonsense to talk about value except as value for mankind. So what Naess basically is trying to present that shallow ecology considers anything as valuable only in terms of its utility for human beings. Why? Because it is an anthropocentric perspective. It doesn't believe in intrinsic value of nature. He further adds that plant species should be saved because of their value as genetic reserve for human agriculture and medicine. Here, Arne Naess is talking about shallow ecology's perspective that according to it, we need to save anything only because it has value for human use. And therefore, it is having an anthropocentric focus, which prioritizes human health and economic well-being, arguing that environmental preservation should be practiced primarily to benefit humans. So it says that we need to preserve environment, but for what? For fulfilling the need of humans, for ensuring well-being of the humans. Here the question of well-being of nature is not taken into consideration. Rather, what is important? Well-being of human being. Anane says that this shallow ecology approach is based on an idea of weak sustainability. Now, what is the meaning of weak sustainability? It argues that economic growth and environmental growth can coexist. Why? Because natural resources can be substituted with man made capital. So it says that there are solutions to the limits of natural ecosystem. The major goal is to fulfill human needs to ensure human well-being. So if we can find out some way through which we can replace the need for natural resources with man-made capital, the problem can be solved. It is very natural because it doesn't places well-being of nature at the center, and therefore it argues for substitutability, market based approach, and gradual change. So basically, it sees what that if we can create that kind of man made capital through which the needs of human being can be fulfilled. So man made capital can be substituted or can substitute natural resources. It look for solution in market. It somehow also talks about a kind of technocratic solution to this, and therefore it talks about gradual change. And therefore, RNA says that shallow ecology concerns are relatively local and selective, only for the health and affluence in the developed countries. So, the health of nature is not its concern. And therefore, RNA says what? That this kind of approach cannot handle the present problem of climate change. We need a much deeper approach to deal with this issue. And therefore, he suggests deep ecology. Now we'll try to understand what is deep ecology. Basically, it places two major ideas. First, it says that there must be a shift from human centered anthropocentrism to ecocentrism. Now we need to understand that what is the meaning of shifting from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism. So when we talk about anthropocentrism, we keep human need, human perspective at the center, and we see everything from that perspective. Why? Because man is the measure of everything. But when we talk about ecocentric, so it keeps nature at the center. It doesn't give any kind of priority to human in this whole system. All the entities existing in the ecosystem, they have equal value. And therefore, Arnenes in deep ecology says that we need to move from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism, where when it comes to uh, evaluating things, we need to understand that every living thing is seen as having inherent value, irrespective of its utility. So, whatever is existing in this ecosystem, they are valuable in their own self. They need not to be evaluated in terms of its utility for human society. Second, that humans are very much part of the nature. They are not superior to it, they are not separate from it. And since they are part of nature, so their well being is integrally associated with nature. Nature is not an other outside, rather, it is very much an extension of the being of the human. And therefore, what do they need? They must protect this earth, this planet, in the same way as they would protect their family or self. So, these are the two major ideas which have been presented by deep ecology. Now, deep ecology talks about a very important concept, that is a relational total field image. Arnenes argues that the mechanistic view of the world and the idea of atomistic individualism. Now, what is atomistic individualism? Which believes that an individual possesses a separate essence. He says this very way of defining individual does what? It separates the human self from the rest of the world, from the other human beings as well as from nature. Why? Because now this individual can define himself in separation with other. So his well-being is not connected to others. Arnenes argues that this way of perceiving individual and this very way of perceiving the relation between individual and society as well as individuals and nature, that leads to a kind of selfishness towards other people as well as nature. Why? Because if I'm not connected with others, so I cannot think about their well-being, and that would lead to a kind of selfishness in my behavior towards other people as well as nature. Deep ecology proposes that there should be a different concept of individual as well as the very way of looking at the relationship between individual and nature, and that is the concept of relational total field image. This is basically a kind of holistic perspective of defining individual. It suggests that the identity of a living thing is essentially constituted by its relation to other beings in the world. So, an individual, according to this holistic perspective, cannot be defined, cannot be understood in separation of the world outside. Why? Because his identity is very much constituted with that world. And this is a kind of holistic perspective of defining individual. So this idea of defining individual basically emphasizes connectedness, holistic view, and non-hierarchical relationship among different entities. Why? Because if my very being is connected to the other beings in the world, if they are actually extension of myself, how can I have a relationship with them of hierarchy? So there would not be any hierarchy in this way of defining individual and his relationship with the world. Now, the second very important concept, which is an extension of the first one, that is larger ecological self and self-realization. Deep ecology emphasizes that there is a possibility of identification of the human self with nature. Human beings can enlarge the boundaries of the self by identifying with nature. They need not to see themselves in separation with the nature. Rather, they need to identify themselves with nature. And the moment humans will start to identify with nature, what is going to happen? Nature is a part of ourself. So, how can I have a relationship of domination, of exploitation with my own self? So, nature is very much extension of my own self. Therefore, my relation with nature would be of care, love, empathy. And that is what this larger ecological self idea proposes. Nace upholds that the deep satisfaction that one receives from identification with nature and close partnership with other forms of life contributes significantly to the quality of life. This is very important. Ananias says that this way of looking at nature, this way of defining the very self of the individual, it is not only in the interest of the nature. Why? Because now there is no division between the interest of nature and the interest of individual. He says when we enlarge ourselves this way, when we start connecting ourselves with the other beings in the ecosystem, what happens? He says that gives us a kind of opportunity to lead a life which can be called a qualitative life, which can improve the very quality of life. Further, this deep ecology talks about biocentric equality. And it is, you see, the foundational principle of deep ecology, which says what? That all living entities within this biosphere possess an equal right to exist and flourish and to bloom. All beings who are subject to life, they have equal value, and therefore there should be a relation of equality among all of them. So on the basis of all these points, what we can see that deep ecology demands a major reshuffling in our worldview, in metaphysics, in culture, and every aspect. It is a radical shift. It demands a kind of paradigm shift, and says without that, only through piecemeal changes, through gradual changes, we are not going to handle the situation. And it says, therefore, that we need to replace anthropocentrism with ecocentrism. Now, quickly through this table, I would like to explain the differences between deep ecology and shallow ecology. So, deep ecology talks about ecologism. We have already seen in the first week that ecologism is a kind of radical approach which places ecology at the center. Whereas shallow ecology talks about environmentalism. It can be called an approach of gradual change, piecemeal change, and also a managerial approach. Deep ecology is based on ecocentrism. We have already defined what is ecocentrism. While shallow ecology talks about light prudential anthropocentrism. Now we need to understand what is this light prudential anthropocentrism. So, in the age of enlightenment, we can say the philosophy was anthropocentric, where it was emphasized that human ability of reason can solve every problem of this universe. And this whole planet is for human beings. They can use as much as they can use. But very soon, what happened? It was realized that this ecosystem has its own limit. And this made humans realize that they need certain changes in their behavior. They need to use these resources prudentially. The central point was same that these resources are for them, but they could understand that if they want to leave these resources for their future generation, certain modifications are required. So this kind of anthropocentrism is called prudential anthropocentrism, and shallow ecology talks about this prudential anthropocentrism. Now, deep ecology is quite mystical when it talks about the relation between individual and nature, and when it talks about the solution for ecological crisis, it gets a lot of inspiration from the Eastern religious tradition, and therefore there's a element of mysticism in that. Whereas shallow ecology primarily is a scientific approach. Deep ecology talks about nature, and shallow ecology talks about humankind at the center. Deep ecology talks about holism that we had seen just now, and its idea of holism is radical. Shallow ecology also talks about holism. It also realizes that our well being is connected with the well being of nature, but its holism is a kind of reluctant holism. Deep ecology talks about intrinsic value of nature. Nature itself is valuable irrespective of its utility. Whereas shallow ecology talks about instrumental value of nature. It is very valuable, but why? Because it is required to fulfill human needs. Deep ecology talks in terms of biocentric equality, that all living beings have equal value. Shallow ecology talks about conserving non-human nature. So obviously, this very term makes it very clear that here the relation would not be of equality. Deep ecology would talk about animal rights. Why? Because if all living beings are equal, so all beings who are subject to life, they are also subject to rights, and therefore they would talk about animal right. Shallow ecology will talk about only animal welfare. So, deep ecology talks about anti growth, while shallow ecology talks about sustainable growth. It says that no, we need growth, but at a pace which can ensure that this growth can continue for our future generations also. So, In this way, we can say deep ecology talks about ecological consciousness, where shallow ecology talks about personal development. So, this is how we can differentiate between deep ecology and shallow ecology. Now, we'll talk about basic principles of deep ecology, which has been developed by George Session and Arne Naess while they were camping in Death Valley. And they talked about 15 principles of deep ecology. Here, I'll be discussing some major principles. First, the well being and flourishing of human and non human life on earth have value in themselves. These values are independent of the usefulness of the non human world for human purposes, that is, intrinsic value of nature. Second, richness and diversity of life forms contribute to the realization of these values and are also values in themselves. Third, humans have no right to reduce this richness and diversity except to satisfy vital needs. So, human can use natural resources only for satisfying vital need. They are not the owner of this planet. Flourishing of human life and non-human life and cultures is compatible with a substantial decrease of the human population. So it says what is essential, that we need to decrease human population. The present human interference with non-human world is excessive and the situation is rapidly worsening. We need to control that. And how can we control that? We need a policy transformation. This policy will transform basic economic, technological, and ideological structures. So you see, it doesn't say that we need mere small changes. It says that we need transformation. Next, the ideological changes are required that can appreciate quality of life rather than adhering to an increasingly higher standard of living. So it says there should be a profound awareness of the difference between big and great. What we need to focus on, that is quality of life, not the quantity of our consumption goods. That doesn't shape or define quality of life. And finally, it says that those who subscribe to these foregoing points have an obligation, directly or indirectly, to try to implement the necessary changes. So these are the major principles of deep ecology as laid down by Arne Naess and George Session. Now we will talk about certain actions suggested by deep ecology. First, it emphasizes a lot on wilderness preservation. You see, Arne Naess gives a picture of ecologically balanced planet. He says what? An ideal ecological balance on the planet might consist of one third wilderness, one third free nature, and one third cities, road, agriculture, etc., for intensive human inhabitation of the planet. So you see the kind of ecologically balanced planet he's talking about is so different from our present situation. He's saying that only one third of planet should be for intensive human inhabitation. And now when we are seeing the increasing number of cities and uh, even rural areas where we have human inhabitation increasing. So it seems that the kind of idea he's talking about is very, very different from the present situation. The second, it talks about population control. Why? Because population increase is creating pressure on environment, and if we want to reduce this pressure, we need to work on population control. And it also talks about the idea of biorealism. You see, it is a concept which has been advocated by eco-anarchists and eco-fascists and also by deep ecology. Basically, it is based on a few principles like local self-sufficiency, decentralization, and ecological awareness. It says that we need to live in tune with the character of geographical region. We need not to impose things from outside. Now we'll talk about the critique. A major critique of deep ecology comes from various perspectives. Like one major argument is that it engages too much with philosophical questions, with metaphysical questions, what ought to be a relationship between humanity and nature. So critiques say it is this metaphysical drift sometime that makes deep ecology quite abstract. When it comes to offering day to day guidelines for environmental decision making, it offers vague suggestions. It remains unduly and unfortunately ambiguous. And when there are issues that human and non human interests are colliding, how to solve that? On that point, also, we do not find much solution from deep ecology. Why? Because the actionable advice which it offers, critique argue that it often resembles with reformed anthropocentric solution rather than offering distinct alternatives. So, one major critique is on the ground that in terms of giving guidelines for day to day environmental decision making, deep ecology doesn't contribute much. A very important critique of deep ecology comes from social ecologist perspective. Thinkers like Murray Bookchin, they find deep ecology's human versus nature framework as oversimplification of environmental question. Why? Because it fails in examining the role of class, capitalism, and other structures of domination. And unless we talk about these structures of domination, we cannot understand the true nature of problem. One very important argument against deep ecology has been that number of radical ecological movements who claim to be inspired by deep ecology, they have supported extreme steps like eco sabotage. And critics argue that this priority given to nature over human needs some kind of rethinking. A very important critique of deep ecology comes from third world perspective. Critics like Ramchandra Gruha argues that deep ecology is primarily a Western perspective to environmental preservation, and it fails in taking into consideration the realities of the developing societies. Why? They argue that this deep ecology appears to emerge from societies which can be called post material society, where material needs have been fulfilled. So now they are talking about quality of life. Now, those societies which are still struggling with the issue of fulfillment of material need, their realities are different. And deep ecology doesn't take that into consideration. Ramchandra Guha gives a very interesting example. He says that all the wilderness preservation effort, which is advocated by deep ecology, would impact the poor people in the third world differently. Like there have been cases where for protecting environment, for protecting species, if any bird life sanctuary is planned, so it has been seen that rural people from this area have been displaced. And here comes the issue of the interest of nature versus people. And Ramchandra Guha says that these aspects needs to be seen from the perspective of third world also, but deep ecology appears to be mainly a Western approach of looking at things. So these are the major critiques. Now these are the references that I have used, and you can use that as suggested readings and activity questions. Firstly, you have to differentiate between shallow ecology and deep ecology. We have discussed this thing in detail. Second, I expect you to read the article by Ramchandra Guha, Radical Environmentalism, a Third World Critique. This article is published in Caroline Merchant's book, Key Concepts in Critical Theory Ecology. And once you go through this article, then critically examine the arguments of deep ecology from the perspective of developing societies on the basis of arguments given by Guha. This will help you to understand the deep ecology perspective critically. So, thank you, learners. Today we discussed various aspects of deep ecology and shallow ecology, various concepts associated with deep ecology, and also we discussed the critiques of deep ecology. So, thank you for joining the session. Go through the lecture. And if you have any doubt, any query, so you can post your queries, your doubts in the discussion forum. Now we'll meet in the next lecture. Thank you.